Hello everyone, welcome to this special video where I'm gonna talk about how to represent software requirements. You know that software requirements are marred with many misses, for example, misinformation, misrepresentation, misinterpretation. That's the reason I came up with this particular model. If you are gonna use this, the chances of having those misses reduces drastically. So let's go ahead and see what it is and how you can make use of it. So very warm welcome to this particular video, and topic of this video is describing software requirements using visualization technique called CDP and not by text based user stories. Okay, so let's start from here. By statistics, most of the organization teams uses Scrum as part of their day-to-day working methodology. Scrum has something called product backlog and sprint backlog. It is the place where requirements are being kept, and the most preferred way of keeping requirements in product or sprint backlog is user stories. Now, if you are using Scrum and using user stories, here is something very important you should know. User stories are not part of Scrum. Yes, you have heard it right. User stories are not part of Scrum. It was created by Extreme Programming XP more than 20 years back, but it is being adopted in Scrum to depict sprint and product backlog. It is not Scrum, not part of Scrum. Scrum by itself, as per Scrum guide, doesn't mandate the usage of user stories as a requirement representation. Now, before I go further, I want to just give a small disclaimer. I am not saying that user stories are bad. If it serves your purpose, go ahead and use it. There is no denying the fact that it can work in some of the places. But user stories were created more than 20 years back when today's software characteristics, complexities, deployment techniques were not available. For example, cloud, machine learning, artificial intelligence, distributed computing, non-monolithic systems. They were not there when this user story concept was created. What I am trying to say is that there are better ways to represent the requirements as compared to user stories. That's all what I am saying, and let me introduce the CDP model. But before I introduce CDP model, I will tell you one thing. You know what? Research after research, it has been proven that a picture indeed speaks 1,000 words. Given a picture, the chances that someone understands and comprehend the context and content about that particular picture is much more as compared to text-based user stories or text-based descriptions. But still, we are not using any visual method to represent the software requirements. Why? Maybe because there were no universal way of depicting software requirements visually until now. Now let me introduce you to CDP. CDP stands for Consume, Dutch, Produce. Okay, it is a method of visually representing software requirements. Now this method is actually based on CPU's input process output, but it has been changed to accommodate the complexities and characteristics of software development. Hence it is changed to Consume, Dutch and Produce. So you will ask me a question, what exactly is CDP? What is meant by Consume, Dutch, Produce? Now hear me out. All software does something, right? But it cannot do something out of thin air. It needs some things to do something. For example, let's assume that a software sums two numbers. It needs couple of number. Another software which streams a movie, it needs a URL and movie name bare minimum to stream the movie back to you. Okay, so it consumes something, does something and produces the output, and the software is judged based on the output it produces. So that completes the cycles of consume, does, produce. What I am showing over here is a way of representing this consume, does, produce pictorially in software requirements. Okay, before I show you some example, let me tell you one very important thing. The biggest advantage of visual representation model is that everyone can understand the requirement, be it be software developer, stakeholders or people from the management who are slightly away from day-to-day development practices. They can also understand the requirement, and this is what we want and we wanted in software industry for a long time. Now here is how CDP looks like. So CDP refers to consume, does, produce. It consumes one or more things, does one or more things, and produce one or more things, as you can see from this particular picture. Okay, this is the CDP model: consume, does, produce. Now let's see some example. I'll start with a very generic example. Let's assume that you need to build your home and you want to generate requirement for the same. Now let's first understand from the user story perspective how it will look like when we talk about user story. So here is the user story. As a house owner, I want to build my house so that I can live in that. Makes sense, some variations, but as a I want, so that that's the way we are writing user stories. Now here is how it will be represented using CDP model. Now you can see on your screen the CDP representation for building a house. Now what it depicts to you? It says to you that it consumes cement, bricks, labor, and does construction, produce house. Which looks better, user story or this one? I'll leave the answer to you, but there are three specific things about which I'll talk about. The CDP, consume, does, produce, clearly explains what will be consumed to produce something. It's very easy to say, okay, I want this, but what will be needed to fulfill that I want? Okay, so consume clearly explains what all is needed, not only to software developer but also to stakeholders. Okay, now the does part is the actual requirement, what it does with the items it consumes. Okay, it can be treated as a gray box because this does can represent the requirement at 35,000 feet view or at 1000 feet view. Okay, third and biggest advantage is that if you are creating a 20,000 feet view or 15,000 feet view, 10,000, 1000 feet view, all this view will automatically map to a top 35,000 feet view. So there is no extra dependency mapping that needs to be done in CDP. The dependencies are mapped automatically. There is no syntax for connecting some lines to mark some dependencies. No, it's just a purely hierarchical method of requirement management. Okay, now I have shown you a requirement for building a house. You may ask that, okay, building a house is a big requirement. We generally tend to break the requirements into smaller entities so that we can complete those things at one sprint or two sprint and so on and so forth. So let's see how it will look like when we break the building a house into multiple requirements. Now let's assume that building the house consists of two distinct requirements. One is building walls and ceiling, second is painting. Now here is how it will look like in a CDP model. You can see now, right? What I am saying, there is a bigger requirement which consumes cement, brick, paint, labor and does construction, produce the house. But there are two smaller requirements. One requirement is building wall and ceiling. Building wall and ceiling requirement takes cement, bricks, labor. It produces the house with walls and ceiling. That goes as an input to painting requirement, which is build walls. It takes paints as an additional thing, labor, and produce the house. Okay, in here we can not only relate the placement of requirements and understand it, we can also negotiate a totally different contract for different requirements. It is also very clear that what is needed for a requirement to commence. Okay, now how does it looks like compared to user story? Try writing some user story, then you have to map it manually. Try and see how it looks like as compared to this one. Okay, now if you still think that visual reference model or CDP model is not good enough, you may skip the rest of the video, because now I'm going to talk about a real software requirement and let you know how you can represent the same using CDP model. So let's start. The requirement is that we have to build a microservice, let's call it date time service, which tells the user what is current date and time. You know, a microservice is a small service which is doing one atomic work kind of thing. Okay, and it is deployed somewhere in the cloud. So the microservice is a date time service and it tells user the current date and time. Now let's first try to write text-based user story to see how it will look like. So here is the user story. As a microservice, I want to provide current date and time so that system components can set the correct date and time. Makes sense? Okay, some words here and there, but this is the general way this requirement would be written. Now let's see how it will look like with the CDP model. Here is how it will look like in the CDP model. Surprised? I know you are surprised because when I'm talking about consume, I am saying it consume REST request. It also exposes a service of TCP in XYZ port. It does date and time calculation and returns, produces either REST response or TCP reply or both, depending upon the circumstances. Isn't the requirement is absolutely clear with this particular picture? Show the user story to a stakeholder, okay, you will come to know what is the difference. By all means, text-based user stories cannot and will not be able to communicate the requirements so clearly. First of all, this actually tells that what it will need to do the work. In user story, there is no way you can actually represent the same in one user story. You need to try out different user stories. Okay, it also tells you what will be produced and it also tells you what it does. Now, one of the additional advantage of representing CDP model, suppose at later point of time you want to change the requirement. Okay, for example, you want to add support for GraphQL in the existing requirement. Here is how you can represent that. Instead of writing a new user story, you just add GraphQL with some lines indicating that it's a new requirement. Okay, in here GraphQL consume and GraphQL produce is a new requirement, but whenever someone looks into this particular picture, they know that okay, it is a requirement which is already being delivered, but we are adding a new functionality and this is the new functionality. How will you explain the same in a user story? Somebody has to go and read another user story. Okay, so this guy wins over here. Okay, unlike user stories, we are not writing new requirement. Now let's talk about breaking the microservice into individual work items. So you know that building a microservice may be time consuming job, so you want to break the requirements into smaller requirements so that you can deliver the requirements in a sprint or couple of sprint. Okay, so how will you do that? Let's take the same example, right? Let's assume that this date time service has an internal requirement which talks about NTP connect and fetch. So where does the date time service gets the current time from? It takes the current time from a NTP server, network time protocol server. Okay, it connects to that server, gets the date and time and return it to user. Let's assume that that's a separate requirement. So here is how the requirement will look like in CDP model. See it. Consume, it is an API call for this particular requirement, but it needs something. It needs network plus server info. It does, gets the current date and time and returns you date and time. Even for a layman, it's amply clear that to have this requirement working, we need some additional server called NTP server. Okay. Now let me tell you something about CDP model which is gonna mesmerize you. Let's assume that I want to develop this requirement, but I still don't have network and server info with me. Isn't something like this happening all the time in our software development? Something which is needed for me to work is not available by other team, by other company, or if I am taking service, some paid service, some contract negotiation is going on and you don't have that service as of now, but you want to proceed ahead and do the work. What will you do? In this particular case, let's assume that you still don't have network time protocol server available with you, but you want to go ahead with the requirement because most of the thing will be same. Okay, and you can complete it. Here is how you can represent it in CDP model. What you are saying is that okay, I'll complete this requirement, but network and server info, I will be either mocking it, stubbing it, or will be using a local NTP server, and you are actually representing the same in the requirement. So anybody sees the requirement, when they see that a requirement is completed, they know that some aspect is being mocked. How will you explain when you give demo to a stakeholder stating that okay, this user story is complete? How will you define what is being mocked, what is locally being used to make sure that requirement is complete? This cannot be possible, but these things happens all the time. You cannot stop things just because something is not available. Okay, that's just an entry point. Okay, and I'm either calling a mocking function or the real function. That's the only change. And later on, when the NTP server is available, use the same requirement by removing it, mock, stub or local bracket from that, so that your requirement moves from this to this. Okay, and everyone knows that when this requirement is taken, they know that this requirement evolved from this to this. So what will be needed in this particular requirement now? Another best thing about CDP model is evolution of requirement. So one requirement, when we initially conceive it, this was looking like this. Now this is looking like this, and now this is looking like this. We can understand that how our requirement evolved. We may have added something, we may have removed something, but that's all about our learning. That is agile, inspect and adapt of our requirement. Okay, something makes sense, something doesn't make sense. You know what changed, how it went through, what was the trigger points, and it's clear for everyone: programmers, developers, managers, and stakeholders. Okay, it's clear for everyone. That's why I have created this CDP model called consume does produce to represent the software requirement. Now I know that it might be difficult for you to understand it completely. I'm in a process of creating lots and lots of example in my website and also on my GitHub page. Please do visit them regularly to understand the same. That's all for this particular video, guys. Thanks a lot. Thanks for watching. Please take a moment to like, comment, share and subscribe. Thank you. Thanks a lot.